All right, hello everybody. What we're going to be covering in today's lecture is a discussion on entertainment and how entertainment is playing this increasingly large role in sociology in terms of political analysis. So, whereas when we looked at politics, we looked at mass media, we used to really kind of gravitate almost strictly towards news, and understandably so. There's a very long history of news interacting with um, politics, but we're starting to come back and reassess that sole understanding of that particular type of mass media as it relates to politics. So instead of just looking at news, we're also starting to do scholarship is being created rather on this idea that entertainment plays this much larger and much more important role than we've really given it credit for to this point. So some of this you're already familiar with, just from being kind of casual viewers of mass media, but we have this situation where the distinction, the separation between news and entertainment seems to be becoming blurred. And really, throughout most of sociological history, save maybe the past 10 to 15 years, this blurring was seen as a decidedly bad thing. So when news, the purpose of news was there to entertain, uh, we got this thing that we called infotainment, and this kind of really light, fluffy news that uh, really wouldn't stir critical passions. It would not inform people in order for them to be informed citizens. So news and entertainment are blurred, or at least the difference between them is blurred. We developed this thing called infotainment, and many people see this as a negative. So this leads to a public life that's not nearly as rich as it otherwise could or should be. And that stands to reason because entertainment or infotainment more broadly, it's there for pleasing the senses. It's not necessarily there to challenge us. It's not necessarily there to uh, get us to think, and certainly get us to look at maybe some of the more unpleasant aspects of our social collective lives. So infotainment, just like any other form of entertainment, causes a distraction. So where we'll be looking here is challenging that, or at least at the very least offering an alternative explanation that is there a way that we could think of entertainment as actually being good for politics and public life? Can entertainment make us better in terms of better informed and better engaged citizens? And are there some ways that this even does it more effectively than, say, news would do it itself? So when we move on to looking at the slide entitled Cultural Distinctions between news and entertainment, we need to understand that at its heart, the public sphere, this area and practice of social life where people get together to discuss what's of mutual interest to them, which makes it of public interest. The public sphere is where public opinion tends to get generated, formed, and it's imbued with some sort of power of influence in that public opinion can sway what forms policy takes. Well, mass media has always been involved in this process. Since the very beginning, the very early concepts of the public sphere, we have always talked about mass media as playing a component, because otherwise, the public sphere describes this interchange between people. Since people can't always get together, be in the same spot, you need something to mediate between people separated by physical distance and by time. Mass media was the way to do this. So think about what a newspaper does, for instance. It takes a conversation in our case, let's assume about politics, going on at one place and one time, and it allows it to be distributed broadly so that conversation can continue elsewhere. So in this way, entertainment can form what we call, again, this imagined community, this idea that there are other people involved in these same kind of practices that you are, and even though you might not meet, and even though you might be separated by distance, let alone, or in addition to that, time, you could still identify with this kind of group. Now, what mass media did was create what we're going to call, or what we can call, an intersubjective imagined community. One of the ideas of intersubjectivity, why we're putting that adjective in front, is that intersubjective refers to the idea of a common type of framework. So we're all operating on the same page. We all have the same kind of basic understandings, basic information in front of us. This makes conversation intelligible. We're using the same concepts. We're using the same definitions, or at least we're using the same concepts and definitions as a starting off point. In addition, besides this intersubjectivity, mass media has a power in that it's intertextual. Now, think of intertextual as hyperlinks on a web page. Intertextual is the way one particular text references another. So in this case, one text is going to reference another type of political conversation going on in some place. So something's referring to something else, and this allows the conversation to be to reach further, to be certainly more broad in scope. And I guess in turn that also means that the conversation ideally is at least, or again, is at least ideally more inclusive. So when we see here that media, and again, we're still kind of referring to news, haven't quite jumped into entertainment yet, but the idea is to create a sense of the world and to give us a place where we can have a discussion about that sense of the world. Have a discussion about what that holds in terms of our collective lives together, and what politics is going to do, or how it's going to shape whatever it is that we happen to be talking about. Now, if we go on to the next slide, what we did here was point out a few differences in just the way that we describe journalism and entertainment. And the reason for doing this is to give us a sense of even the very language that we use to describe both different terms gives it a different aura, gives it a different feeling, it gives it a different connotation. So journalism, historically, we've always referred to as a profession, right? It's the news profession, staffed by professional journalists and with their own rules and regulations, their own associations, all of that good stuff. But a profession makes it a distinct kind of institution. And in journalism, as a profession, we need to recognize what those two bullet points that are directly below. The first being that, one, authority comes from the fact that journalism is supposed to be giving a objective overview of a particular event or topic that they happen to be discussing. So the idea that they stick to facts, the idea that they are detached and chronicling whatever happens to be unfolding in the public sphere, this is where they get their authority from. So if the journalist can claim, we are presenting this in a factual way, we're presenting this in an objective way, that is seen as, okay, well, this is why we listen to what journalism has to write or broadcast or whatever media we're getting it through. This is why we're listening to what journalism and journalists say. Now, to see who has more authority in journalism, who is regarded as the most credible, whoever can command kind of this most respect in terms of living up to the ideals of the profession, we see we see this dynamic based on, well, who gets honored in this profession. So who wins the Pulitzer Prize? Who gets ranked as participating on one of the most circulated newspapers in the country? Who is winning awards for their columns? Who gets the best connections to insiders? People that they happen to need access to, politicians, party officials, other sorts of government officials, if not necessarily politicians. And are they being recognized for these things by their fellow journalists? I mean, that's who usually votes on who gets these awards when they're given out. Now, on the other hand, entertainment, we do not usually call a business. Just like the adage goes, there's no business like show business. Well, entertainment is exactly that. We treat it as a business. It's not there to necessarily tell us the truth. It's not there to objectively chronicle anything, although at times it might do this. What it's really there is to, as we write in the slide, to capture the emotion and drama of real life. It wants to give us a rich recreation that fits this kind of, it provokes this kind of emotive response, wherein we want to feel something, where we want to have some sort of, again, feeling or emotion activated, and it's done to communicate something powerfully without necessarily having to have this kind of detached and kind of critical and removed gaze on its subject, right? Entertainment could get right up and very directly into things. Now here, it's not so much honors, although we do see awards like the Grammys, or not Grammys for music, the Academy Awards, and the Cable Ace Awards, all that stuff, where people do get honored for artistic licenses. But entertainment, we usually judge whether or not it succeeds by how large our audience is, and how large are profits. Can they sell a lot of advertising space, or they raise a lot at the box office, and how many people actually pay attention? So whereas journalism, how truthfully can you tell something? Entertainment, well, how many people seem to be attracted to the story that you are in fact telling? Now, when we start moving into this new idea that entertainment is going to be playing a role, more so than previously thought, we need to look back and see what the role of fiction is, or entertainment more broadly, in the public sphere. And if we actually go back and look at the record, and a lot of this work on the public sphere starts with Habermas's 1969 book, but wasn't translated into English until the late 1980s. The public sphere actually developed out of something called a literary public sphere. So the political public sphere developed out of this literary public sphere. So before people got together to talk about politics, they got together to talk about literature. And literature was fictional, or at least in the case that, Habermas makes and points out. And in addition to that, we also have to remember that at a time where free speech wasn't protected, fiction was often a safer way to make political critiques and certainly give political commentary, because if the powers that be came to you, you could always just say, hey, I'm just writing a story. It's just fiction. It's not what I intended. And it provided you with a little bit more cover. So we need to keep those in mind, at least for a historical sense. But more importantly, if we are kind of looking at entertainment in this more contemporary sense, we want to note that although entertainment, its purpose is to gather a large audience, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. So figure that maybe 4 or 5 million people turn into a nightly news broadcast, something like on NBC or CBS, the national news. we almost get double to 3 times that amount possibly tuning in for the sitcom or the drama that's going to go on during prime time. So if we want to talk about expanding the public sphere, maybe that large circulation size is an important factor to consider, that really entertainment, hands down, beats news. And we also have been seeing, and this is not new, but there's been new research kind of highlighting this, that entertainment seems to talk about very serious things just as much as any news broadcasts were. So whether you're watching a cartoon, or whether you're watching a drama or a reality television show or a sitcom, whatever it happens to be, think about the kind of topics that they bring up to talk about. Do they talk about, things that affect the family, divorce, and certainly issues of substance abuse that could come and impact the family? They talk about the idea of the changing dynamics of families. They talk about, or they can talk about war. They can talk about issues with the economy, and we could just think of a whole host of shows off the top of our head. Whether it's something like Modern Family or The West Wing or South Park for that matter, all of these shows, and you could think of even the late shows, whether it was The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, or even some of the new late shows that are on with the new hosts. They tend to talk, albeit in sometimes a very humorous way, about very serious things that are covered in the press. So the fact that entertainment was seen as not serious, can't talk about politics, well, maybe we should reevaluate that. And we also have to see how fiction and what's prized in fiction seems to work its way into news during particular types of events that go on. And we write there that this is most notable during what we call a ritual event. Let's think of something like the presidential inauguration. Let's think of something like the presidential election. Let's think of something like maybe July 4th coverage, or crises. So when a terrorist attack happens, or when there is some sort of natural disaster, what we see is that journalists, who again, these objective types, they start using this kind of poetic and flowery language in order to describe what's going on, right? They try to reach us on an emotional level, often taking these kind of tropes from the world of fiction. And more so than that, when journalists get judged on their writing, they usually get judged by other journalists in terms of their literary standards. Not, are they really reporting the facts well, but do they report the facts in such a way where their writing comes across as powerful, as really flowing and entertaining. So we see that although we have separated news and journalism, maybe, especially when it comes to political discussion, we should start rethinking and reevaluating that type of position. Now, we're on the slide that's titled The Decline Narrative at this point. And the decline narrative gets back to what we were speaking about on the first slide, and that is the historical trajectory, is what we mean, the development of the story of news in the social science, or sociology in particular, and entertainment. And here we're using television, and I'll explain why in a moment, newspapers and TV to represent the former journalism and the latter entertainment. That the decline narrative says, as these things became blended or blurred, the distinctions between them became blurred, this was going to lead to something bad for the public sphere, something bad for politics. And we could kind of understand why this distinction and why we use these examples when we talk about the decline narrative. So newspapers were generally thought of as being there for this type of public discussion. The editorial page and the news section were supposed to be these two components that would organize and push forward political conversation. When we compare that with television, when television first came out, it was a novelty that was supposed to be there for really two things: advertising, and in addition to advertising, it was also supposed to be there for entertainment. Of course, entertainment captures our attention better, and this is where it becomes more valuable for advertisers to buy space. So when we talk about television as it first came out, if there was anything that had to do with news, it was really kind of an afterthought. And this is much different from what we look at today. We have 24-hour news stations, right? We could turn on certain channels and there's nothing we will see but news. Maybe not always the most hard-hitting journalism, but news nonetheless. But we have to consider what the history of this is. So if news was thought of for television, at best it was thought of what we could call an afterthought. We didn't really think, or at least those who were first doing television programming, didn't really allot for news. So news was seen as a public service, and TV stations, since they're broadcasting over public airwaves, needed to put something in for public service. In order for them to use the public airwaves to broadcast. So when news made it to TV stations, it was usually limited to about 15 minutes a day. So at most, you would see a news broadcast for 15 minutes a day, not very hard-hitting, not very deep, usually just somebody reading something from a newspaper, and that was about it. The first time that we actually had a first half-an-hour news broadcast was on CBS, and this didn't happen until the early 1960s, which means television has been out for almost 2 decades at this point, and we really haven't seen any dedicated news stations yet, or forget news stations, news programs. So we had them certainly in newspapers, they were certainly existing on radio, but as far as TV went, again, it was not until the early 1960s where CBS puts on the first half-hour news broadcast. NBC would follow about a year or two after. ABC would follow towards the end of the 1960s. Still, news was being broadcast half an hour a day, and usually at about the 6:30 hour that we see it on now. News didn't make it into prime time, or anything remotely looking like news didn't make it into prime time until really the late 1970s, early 1980s. So we have the idea of 60 Minutes starting, Nightline starting, which were really the first news magazine programs, but they did not start again until really just about the 1980s. And so this is now 4 decades after television started before we saw news in actual prime time. We have the first cable news network, the first network dedicated to news 24/7 was CNN, and that did not develop until the later, the mid part of the 1980s. Actually, maybe it was a little bit earlier. Let's just say mid. My memory is being fuzzy at the moment. The mid 1980s as it was. So here, it's taking us nearly 40 to 50 years in order for news on television to actually become this kind of fixed institution. Now, after this happened, we see that this is where people who were big critics of entertainment and news on TV started seeing this idea of infotainment, because of course they need to retain large audiences, you need to make the news a little bit more fluffy and a little bit more fun. Now, what these people who pick up and focus on this idea of the decline, who adhere or who believe in this decline narrative, for them, there were a lot of pressures that were making mass media companies put their emphasis on broadcast entertainment. It was much more profitable, and they wanted to really push their media empires that way. On the other hand, this, they feel, adversely affected news, in particular newspapers, because newspapers were not so profitable. And as we have seen as years gone by, especially, and this is complicated or compounded by news services that are online, newspapers are becoming tougher and tougher to sustain and to sustain profitably. So what were some of these institutional pressures? Well, in the mid-1990s, we had the first revision of the telecommunication laws revised, or rather, we had the first revision of the telecommunication laws in the mid-1990s since the 1930s. So we went from a time when radio barely existed and never rewrote many of our telecommunication laws until a time where the World Wide Web became really available to us. Now, what these revisions to the law did, and this was under the Clinton administration, 1996 is the year I believe it went through, it was passed. What the biggest thing that these did was it struck down barriers to what particular media companies could own. So, laws that said you could only own so many media companies. You could only own a newspaper or a radio station or a TV station in a given market. You can't own all of them, or you can't own multiple television stations. All the regulations in place that were put there in order to say, well, we need the biggest diversity of opinions possible, those were all taken out. Those were all gutted. Now, this is not to put this onus just on Clinton. There was, 15 years of this going on, 15 to 20. I mean, really, since the Reagan administration, the push towards these kind of relaxing and repealing of really what focuses on ownership and content laws were being scaled back. But under Clinton, we had this really big revision of the telecom laws. So where we had pretty big news conglomerates or media conglomerates before, now we have super big media conglomerates after. Now, in order to also be competitive, newspapers had to reduce their costs so they would be more profitable. They did this, unfortunately, namely through consolidation. One, consolidating news physical resources. So we don't have as many foreign offices open. We don't have as widespread of coverage. But the biggest resource that newspapers were able to scale back on was actual journalists and writers. And we see news staffs are greatly stripped down. And especially with some of the conglomerates, we see contents repeated. So for instance, USA Today is one of the biggest newspapers in the country. It's usually in the top, it's one of the top 2 or 3 circulated newspapers in the country. Usually it's there every year, or up there every year. They're owned by a company named Gannett. Now, Gannett also owns a whole host of local newspapers all around the country. And if you go to Gannett.com, there's a pretty decent chance, especially if you live in New York, that there's a Gannett paper that's serving either your community or a community that you have heard of that's somewhat local to you. Anyway, if you look in these local papers and you look at their national news sections, or you look at their editorial pages, you'll notice they are the same thing as what appears in USA Today. So what USA Today, or again, Gannett News, was able to do in order to cut down on these costs is that they simply recycle their own content. Now, when we talk about segmentation of newspapers, we're talking about things like the arts and leisure section. We're talking about things like the gardening sections. We're talking about breaking newspapers into these different segments, these different areas, in order to make them more specialized and attract more particular types of audiences. Similar to what we see on television. And this in turn, it's really kind of related to the next bullet point. We make the stories more like telescripts, meaning that instead of these kind of really, well, long-form journalism, certainly, something that goes on for a few columns, if not a few pages, we strip that, but we want short blurbs, we want big headlines, we want nice pictures, and now hopefully links to some sort of online content. We want things that you could read and digest easier and move on so you consume more and more of the newspaper. So stories get shorter, stories get fewer, and instead we see, again, big headlines written and nice big colorful graphics put in order to take up space, make it more attractive. So we are seeing all of these changes taking place, and for those, again, who believe in the decline narrative, this is a real problem. So if we head to this next page, what we see is that all of the people who subscribe to this and say, okay, these are the things that are going on, well, this story really has a tragic ending. That entertainment is just much more profitable, with the fact that our media industries are privately owned and profit is one of the main goals for them to generate. What we are seeing is that serious news that's going to improve us as citizens, is on the decline, but we also are going to see this trend not reversing. And we just listed a few examples of this, underneath, where we're seeing this blurring between news and entertainment. So these kind of interview shows like we would see on Larry King or Glenn Beck, we see people like Oprah really kind of having the same type of practices. We see it's very profitable for her. So in turn, we see these types of shows becoming more and more aligned. Hannity and Combs, which used to be a debate show, now Hannity is the only host left on that program. Well, we see these similar kind of debates that are not really debates as much as they are fights when we look at something like Jerry Springer and embedded reporting, when we tend to send journalists maybe with a group of soldiers on some, at some sort of participating in some sort of combat. Well, this is just the ultimate form of reality television. So we see all of these different things. But maybe we want to take a step back. And I said perhaps we should approach this with a little bit of skepticism, because we could also talk about the fact that maybe entertainment is not so detrimental for public discussion, or at least not as detrimental as we would have thought. So what's some of the things that we can take a look at why entertainment might actually be a positive contributor rather than one leading to a public sphere that's much more anemic? Well, one thing that we could really look at is something that we kind of mentioned and we broached before. So we know that more people watch entertainment on a regular basis. More people are gonna tune into whatever sitcom or drama is being played in primetime than a nightly news broadcast. We know we might have 20 million people going to the box office for a movie in an opening weekend. What else? We know that people might pick up a bestseller book, fiction, entertainment, or otherwise, more than they would necessarily most newspapers. So maybe instead of looking at this as a bad thing, we should see this as this is expanding the potential or expanding the possibility that more people will participate in the public sphere if they do it through entertainment. And think, what are you more likely to pay attention to? We could go watch a broadcast on PBS, or we could watch an episode of South Park. They both could be discussing the same type of topic. Which one might more people initially tune into? What's going to have a broader mass appeal? And again, even if it's fiction, it doesn't necessarily mean that what is being fictionalized is fluff. They can talk about very serious things, albeit in a fictional setting. The other thing that helps, so again, we're saying the cost of participating in public discussion, access, is much lower. So more people can participate. It becomes much more of an open type of conversation. And the second thing that we really need to hit on is that journalism's biggest strength, that it could say, well, we can authoritatively say this is what's going on in the world. We're taking this very detached and critical stance, right? This removed kind of gaze. Well, and so long as we're being truthful, that's why you should listen to journalists. Well, entertainment could kind of flip that on its head. because entertainment is not constrained by the truth, right? It doesn't have to tell a true story. It could really hit home and really make a point in a very exaggerated way. So again, you can think of, and South Park just keeps coming to mind, they make really over-the-top claims when they talk about current events, but they're doing it to make a point. And they don't have to worry if they make things up. They could take literary or artistic license. And this is true of all fiction. You could hyper-sensationalize something. You could really make the plot fit this one particular message that a piece of entertainment is trying to get across. And because of this, it could tell very powerful stories. So we could say, and again here, that because of this, we have the ability that entertainment is really not only not bad for the public sphere, but it could actually be somewhat beneficial just in ways that we haven't thought. So it opens it up, and it's much more flexible in how it could present politics to us than news. Now, there are two different concepts, or two more specific concepts, that developed out of this work. And we could talk about one, the first, what we call the counterfactual public sphere. And this is where we take fictional characters and we put them into some sort of situation where they're talking about matters of public discussion. They're having discussion, rather, about matters of public or common concern. So what they're really doing is they are enacting a public sphere. So we could think about, you know, a lot of these going on. Murphy Brown and West Wing are a little bit older of shows, but Murphy Brown was about an actual news organization in Washington, D.C. So they were clearly talking about very real things in politics as it was going on. The West Wing was a fictionalized show where Martin Sheen was president of the United States. They would talk about terrorism, they would talk about war, economic downturn, and the rest, all fiction, but talking about very real things that we deal with in the real political world nonetheless. And so not only that, but these, you know, these fictional characters in the counterfactual public sphere, they tend to be then cited by people in actual news and by actual politicians. So Murphy Brown, the show I was talking about before, had a series where the lead, Candice Bergen, whose character was Murphy Brown, the anchor of this, or one of the reporters rather, for this broadcast station, would talk about politics. She was a single mother in the show, and she was actually brought up and spoken about by Vice President Dan Quayle at the time. So these characters came to have this very, very real world presence, this very real world understanding. And this leads into that second term that we're looking at. So not only where fictional people gather and mimic the public sphere, but mimic it in a way where if we didn't know any better, we really couldn't tell the difference, with something we call the aesthetic public sphere. And this is where fiction and entertainment actually become the discussion that goes on in the public sphere itself. So when the New York Times, for instance, would talk about The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, in 2007, he was named as the most trusted man in America. And there was a debate. Is he an entertainer, comedian? Is he a politician? Is he an activist? Is he a journalist? Well, this really became the point of discussion and debate in some very serious circles. So the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, certainly politicians would be mentioning him. So here, they're talking about fiction, they're talking about entertainment, but they're the actual topics that are being discussed in the actually existing public sphere. So those two terms are related, but you know, sort of, the first, again, is describing when the fictional characters actually do the public sphere stuff themselves, and the aesthetic is describing where the actual political public sphere brings entertainment in as part of its discussion. So what's the potential and where do we kind of leave this? Well, the big implications that we're really looking at is something we mentioned a few minutes ago. Mass sociability. The idea that entertainment is going to greatly expand the inclusiveness of our political discussions. It's going to draw in more people, and it's going to draw in more people in not so traditional ways. And this is very, very important, and potentially revolutionary as it's coming to the political public sphere. And when we say that it re-images the public life and all of these into kind of popular formats, it's making discussion of politics engaging. If it makes discussion of politics entertaining, that's not necessarily dumbing something down. That's doing maybe or at least attempting a different way to capture our attention. So this is going to, again, expand the scope of people participating in political discussions, and it also can really bring about the fact that not only will the scope be extended, but more people will be willing to stay within those public discussions to talk. So the short of it is that when we look at entertainment, we really shouldn't dismiss this as a secondary kind of resource to news in the political public sphere. We should see it as an equal, as a complement. And we're not trying to say that news and journalism doesn't have a place or it's not good, but instead of saying journalism is always good and entertainment is always bad for political discussion, we really might want to think about taking the approach that, well, both probably work very well in complement to one another. That really has created a rich political public sphere as opposed to one that's seemingly in decline. All right, well, that's it for this lecture. So we will talk to you again when we talk to you. Take care.